At 79 years old, Dolly Parton has built a legacy wrapped in rhinestones, resilience, and a radiant smile that rarely hints at the pain behind it. For decades, she stayed silent about the betrayal that almost broke her spirit. But now, she's finally naming the man who shattered her trust. And to the shock of many, that name is Elvis Presley. But he wasn't the only one. In a world where men held the contracts and called the shots, Dolly was expected to play along, smile pretty and give up her power. What started as a dream duet with the king of rock and roll ended in one of the most heartbreaking decisions of her career, one that would haunt her and define her legacy. For the first time, Dolly is telling the full truth about the men who tried to steal her voice, and the moment she chose to fight back. What she reveals about Elvis and the others will change how you see her forever. And what happens next rewrites country music history. Dolly Parton's betrayal by Elvis Presley wasn't a tabloid scandal. It was quieter than that. It happened behind closed doors, in hushed negotiations, and it hit her where it hurt most: her music, her independence, and her soul. In the early 1970s, Dolly had just released "I Will Always Love You," a song written during one of the most painful times in her life, the end of her professional partnership with Porter Wagoner. That song, born out of heartbreak and personal sacrifice, was climbing the charts when Dolly received a call that felt like a dream. Elvis Presley wanted to record it. For a girl from the Smoky Mountains who grew up idolizing him, it felt like a sign from heaven. Dolly said yes, without hesitation. The thought of Elvis singing her lyrics was thrilling beyond words, but when the contracts arrived, her excitement turned to devastation. Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, demanded that in order for Elvis to record the song, he would need to own half of the publishing rights. It was a standard deal Parker made with nearly every songwriter Elvis worked with. But Dolly wasn't just any songwriter. She had fought for every inch of success she had, and she knew the value of her words. Giving up half of that song would mean giving away her future. And so, with a heavy heart, Dolly told them no. She walked away from what could have been the biggest opportunity of her career, not out of pride, but out of principle. And Elvis never recorded the song. It broke her heart, not just because of the missed opportunity, but because of the way it made her feel, like just another woman expected to hand over her art to a man with more power. Dolly later admitted she cried all night after turning the deal down. Elvis never called her, never reached out to say he understood, and though she continued to admire him, that wound never fully healed. It wasn't just about Elvis. In that moment she realized something deeper, that even her heroes could become her betrayers. And this was just the beginning. Dolly Parton never forgot the moment she had to say no to Elvis Presley. She was barely into her 30s, still proving herself as a solo artist after years tethered to Porter Wagoner's show. She'd already endured years of being treated like a sidekick, praised for her voice, yes, but constantly underestimated for her mind. And now, with "I Will Always Love You" gaining traction, she finally had something that was hers, a song that marked her freedom. So, when Colonel Tom Parker demanded half of it, it wasn't just a business decision, it was a test of her identity. But walking away from Elvis wasn't the last time Dolly would feel that sting of betrayal. In fact, it wouldn't even be the worst. Because as her career soared and she broke into the mainstream, more men in the industry tried to box her in, use her, and take what wasn't theirs. One of them was her former partner, Porter Wagoner. Though they had years of musical success together, behind the scenes, the relationship had grown toxic. Porter wanted control over the show, over the songs, and at times, over Dolly herself. When she told him she was leaving to pursue her own career, he fought back hard. He even sued her for $3 million, claiming breach of contract and damages. The lawsuit dragged on for years and was settled quietly, but the pain remained. To this day, Dolly describes that chapter of her life as one of the hardest. She wrote, "I will always love you," for Porter, but even that wasn't enough to ease the fallout. The men she trusted most, Elvis, Porter, had both tried to take ownership of something she had created from her own pain. And in both cases, she stood her ground, but not without a cost. The industry kept testing her. Record labels tried to steer her toward pop music completely, thinking her country roots weren't profitable enough. Executives told her to change her look, to tone down the glitz and glamour. One even told her, "You'll never be taken seriously looking like that." But Dolly never changed. She kept the wigs, the rhinestones, and the southern twang, and she proved every one of them wrong. Every man who underestimated her would eventually watch her rise from the sidelines, stunned. And still, the betrayal by Elvis lingered the longest, because she didn't just admire him, she loved him. Not romantically, but spiritually, as an artist, as a fellow Southern kid who had made it big. She wanted to believe they were cut from the same cloth. But the deal proved otherwise. Globalization. Parton was 30 years old when she made one of the most difficult decisions of her life, saying no to Elvis Presley. And it wasn't because she didn't admire him. In fact, she adored him. Wasn't just a singer to Dolly. He was a symbol of Southern power, someone who took country and gospel roots and turned them into something the entire world couldn't ignore. When she heard that he wanted to record "I Will Always Love You," her heart nearly stopped. It felt like destiny. But what came next shattered that dream. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's infamous manager, had one condition. Elvis wouldn't record the song unless they received 50% of the publishing rights. Dolly sat with the offer. She cried over it. She called her advisors, her lawyers, and even her pastor. But no matter how she looked at it, it just didn't sit right. "That song was my life story," Dolly later said in interviews. "Giving that away would have meant giving away a piece of my soul." It would have made her rich, even richer than she already was becoming. Having Elvis Presley record your song in 1974 was like being handed the keys to the kingdom. But Dolly didn't bite. She walked away. "It broke my heart," she admitted. "I cried all night. I wanted to hear him sing it so bad. But I had to stand up for myself." And in doing so, she changed the rules for every woman who came after her. But the heartbreak didn't end with Elvis. Over the years, Dolly would see other men try to chip away at her success. Some were subtle, executives who said she was too flashy, or too country, or too blonde to be taken seriously. Others were more direct. One producer in the late 80s tried to shelve one of her albums because it wasn't sexy enough to compete with the pop charts. He told her to update her image or risk fading out. Dolly refused and released the album anyway. It didn't top the charts, but it reminded her that success wasn't just about sales. It was about staying true to who she was. That act of defiance echoed the Elvis moment all over again. She'd loved him, looked up to him, dreamed of hearing him sing her words. But at the end of the day, Dolly Parton loved herself more. And she would spend the rest of her career proving why that choice was the right one. As Dolly Parton grew older, the betrayals didn't stop. They just changed faces. In her 40s, she began noticing a disturbing pattern in the music industry. People who once praised her for her authenticity suddenly wanted her to conform. Major television producers told her she needed to tone it down. Radio executives hinted that her voice was out of style. Even collaborators who once called her a genius began treating her like a relic. It was subtle at first. Meetings she wasn't invited to, projects she wasn't consulted on. But Dolly, now in her prime, saw it for what it was. They were trying to erase me quietly. Some of her best late-career songs. And she kept showing up, not to prove anything to others, but to herself. Still, the wounds left by men she trusted lingered. One of her longtime producers sold master recordings of her early demo tapes without her knowledge. A male agent, who once promised to protect her image, leaked private letters to the press. Even some fellow country artists she had supported for decades began excluding her from key projects. Once the industry started shifting toward a younger, more radio-friendly crowd. And through it all, the shadow of Elvis remained. Dolly never publicly blamed him. She admired him to the end. But she always carried the weight of what might have been. In recent years, as she began reflecting more openly, she admitted the real pain wasn't Elvis himself. It was the system around him, she said. Colonel Parker, the industry folks. They saw songs like Property, not as somebody's story. And Elvis, he trusted them more than he trusted his own heart. That line hit deep for Dolly, because all her life she had trusted her own heart. And while it had cost her relationships, money, and even fame at times, it had given her something greater. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from never selling your soul. Not to a record label, not to a manager, and not even to the king of rock and roll. By the time Dolly Parton turned 50, she had survived nearly every kind of betrayal an artist could face. Broken contracts, stolen royalties, tabloid lies, and even false friends. Yet somehow, her heart remained open. In her own words, "I've been stabbed in the back so many times, it's a wonder I don't whistle when I turn around." But there was one betrayal that always lingered. One that didn't come from a contract or a crooked manager. It came from someone she once called a brother in music. Porter Wagoner. Their partnership in the late 1960s had catapulted Dolly into the spotlight. On stage, they were a perfect pair. His rugged charisma and her radiant vulnerability created magic. But offstage, their relationship was complicated. Porter was controlling, jealous, and fiercely territorial. Dolly once said, "Porter didn't want me to fly, not because he didn't think I could, but because he was afraid of being left behind." And when she finally left his show to pursue her solo career, he sued her. Not quietly either. The lawsuit made headlines and cast a shadow over everything she'd worked for. Even though they eventually reconciled before his death in 2007, Dolly never forgot the pain. In a later interview, she admitted, "I loved Porter. I really did. But love doesn't mean letting someone clip your wings." It was the kind of betrayal that went deeper than money. It was emotional, it was personal, and it taught her a hard lesson. That not every person who lifts you up wants. Fame grew. So did the envy around her. Backroom whispers turned into boardroom sabotage. She was dropped from key projects, blocked from industry awards, and even mocked by younger artists who didn't understand her impact. But instead of growing bitter, Dolly leaned into kindness. She gave opportunities to other women, often behind the scenes. She helped launch the careers of artists who reminded her of her younger self. Bold, brilliant, and underestimated. Still, there was one betrayal she never spoke of until recently. A powerful Nashville executive had once cornered her early in her career and made her feel unsafe. She never named him, never filed a lawsuit, but the memory haunted her. It was the moment she realized that her beauty, her body, and her talent were all things others thought they could take or control. And from that day forward, she vowed to never let anyone define her path again. Not even Elvis, not even Porter, not even Nashville itself. In her 60s, Dolly Parton began entering a new era, not of reinvention but of reclamation. She wasn't chasing hits anymore. She was chasing truth. And as the spotlight shifted to newer stars, Dolly didn't fade, she sharpened. While many artists softened with age, Dolly became more direct, more reflective, and more willing to expose the cracks beneath her rhinestone smile. Interviews began to hint at the weight she had carried for decades. "People see the wigs, the makeup, the glitter," she once said, "but they don't always see the scars underneath." At this stage of her life, Dolly began naming things for what they were, especially the betrayals that shaped her. And while she continued to speak fondly of Elvis Presley as an artist, she no longer danced around the truth of what happened. "Elvis didn't fight for me," she told one close friend. "He could have, but he didn't. He let Colonel Parker speak for him." That wound never fully healed. It wasn't about the money, or even the song. It was about the silence. Dolly had hoped Elvis would come to her, man to woman, artist to artist, and say, "This is your song. Let me sing it right." But instead, the king bowed to business. No hate in her heart. "I forgave him long ago," she said softly, "but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means understanding and learning what not to do to the next person who looks up to you." During these years, Dolly also began revealing other betrayals, ones that came from close collaborators and trusted advisors. A male business manager mismanaged her finances in the early 2000s, costing her a small fortune. A PR rep sold a private story to the tabloids without her consent. Even within her beloved Dollywood team, she discovered individuals who had profited behind her back. But instead of lawsuits and scorched earth campaigns, Dolly responded with quiet exits and powerful pivots, mentored new voices. She built her empire all over again, this time with bricks she laid herself. And in the midst of this rebuilding, Dolly also returned to her roots. She began writing more, journaling, looking back at old photos and letters. And in doing so, she rediscovered the woman she was before the betrayals, the girl from Sevier County, the songwriter who believed a good lyric could outlive anything. And she realized something. The greatest revenge wasn't success or survival, it was truth. Telling her story, on her terms, without anyone else's approval, not Elvis's, not Porter's, not Nashville's, just hers. As Dolly entered her 70s, she began to drop the glitter just enough to let the truth shimmer through. Not all at once, never in an exposé or a headline-grabbing memoir, but in fragments, in interviews, in lyrics, in brief quiet moments where she let her voice tremble just a little. And what she revealed, piece by piece, was a life not just defined by rhinestones and records, but by betrayal, resilience, and reckoning. The world still saw the icon, the towering hair, the hourglass figure, the 1,000-watt smile. But behind it was a woman who had been burned by many of the men she once trusted most. One of those betrayals came from a young songwriter she had championed in the early 2000s. He had come to her with admiration in his eyes and promises of loyalty. Dolly took him under her wing, invited him to write with her, brought him into private sessions, and then watched as he stole entire verses and pitched them to bigger artists behind her back. She didn't sue, she didn't name him, but she cut him out of her life entirely. "When someone shows you who they are," she later told a friend, "believe them the first time." But for every man who let her down, there were others who showed her that love, loyalty, and decency still existed. Kenny Rogers had never betrayed her, only honored her, supported her, and loved her like a brother. She once said, "Kenny never asked for more than I could give. He saw me, not the star, not the body, me." When Kenny passed away in 2020, Dolly grieved not just the man, but the rare kind of friendship that had become nearly extinct in her world. One based on mutual respect, not ego. One that asked for nothing and offered everything. And then came another reflection. The decades-long tension with Johnny Cash's camp. While she had always respected Johnny's artistry, she had kept her distance from his inner circle, especially after learning that certain individuals close to him had allegedly blocked her from key opportunities in the late 1970s. Dolly never confirmed names, but fans noticed her absence from some of Cash's larger collaborations and tributes. It wasn't just but of how she had chosen every single time not to become them. She didn't harden. She didn't retaliate. She wrote. She created. She endured. And that, perhaps, is the greatest revenge. At 79 years old, Dolly Parton is no longer protecting anyone's legacy but her own. In a rare and emotional moment, during a private interview for an upcoming documentary, she finally put it into words, what she'd held back for nearly half a century. "Elvis betrayed me," she said. Her voice didn't tremble, and she didn't say it with anger. She said it with clarity, with the full weight of memory. He had a chance to stand with me, to stand up for me, and he didn't. He let someone else make the call, and that told me everything I needed to know. The betrayal wasn't about ownership of "I will always love you." It wasn't even about money. It was about power, about being silenced, about watching a man she idolized allow someone else to erase her role in her own creation. She had hoped Elvis would be different. He, too, had been used, manipulated, cornered by the industry. She thought he'd understand, but he didn't. Or maybe he chose not to. But what hurt more than the betrayal itself was how many people, especially men in the business, sided with him. "I remember hearing whispers," she said, "that I was difficult, that I was arrogant, just for saying no, just for wanting to keep my own song." Nashville turned cold on her for a while. The Opry cooled, her phone rang less. And yet, she kept rising. Dolly refused to become bitter, and that is perhaps her most miraculous act. She did not let betrayal define her. Instead, she turned it into fuel. And it wasn't just Elvis. She began naming, in private at first, the other men who tried to control, rewrite, or diminish her. Studiaco head in the 80s who pressured her to go full pop and threatened to cancel her contract. Windshield, a talk show host who touched her without consent backstage. A record executive who told her she'd be forgotten in 5 years if she didn't play nice. She remembered every name, but she also remembered her choice, to outlast them all. And she did. Parton owns her songs, her brand, her likeness, and her legacy. She is one of the wealthiest and most beloved entertainers on the planet, not because she betrayed others, but because she refused to betray herself. Her words about Elvis in that documentary weren't meant to cancel him. For nearly 6 decades, Dolly Parton's name echoed across the world. Her voice, her rhinestones, her hair, all unmistakable. But through it all, one name stayed whispered: Carl Dean, her husband, her mystery, her most loyal companion. Who was he, really? He never gave interviews, never attended award shows, never stood beside her on red carpets. Some fans questioned if he even existed, but Dolly insisted he was always there, just off stage, watching from the shadows. Now, at 79 years old, Dolly Parton is finally breaking her silence about the one man who's stayed by her side through fame, fortune, and firestorms. In this opening chapter, we step into the enigma that is Carl Dean, unseen, unheard, but never unfelt. This isn't just a story about marriage. It's a story about loyalty, sacrifice, and a bond so private that even the world's biggest star chose to keep it hidden. Until now, of all the mysteries that swirl around Dolly Parton's life, the wigs, the surgeries, the rumored affairs, none have captured the public's imagination quite like Carl Dean. Fans knew his name, but not his face. Even paparazzi, with their relentless cameras, could barely catch a glimpse of him. For decades, Dolly remained fiercely protective of him, often joking that he chose me, not my career, and that he preferred mowing the lawn to walking a red carpet. But why such secrecy? Why the near-total erasure of Carl Dean from public view? As Dolly opens up at 79, we begin to understand that it wasn't about hiding shame or embarrassment. It was about shielding something pure. Carl Dean, a man born in Tennessee just like Dolly, was a rugged, quiet soul. He ran an asphalt paving business and had no interest in showbiz. The very idea of Hollywood made him cringe, and yet he fell in love with one of the most glamorous women in the world. From their first meeting outside the wishy-washy laundromat in Nashville in 1964, something clicked. He wasn't dazzled by her potential fame. He was captivated by her heart. Their first date wasn't at a fancy restaurant or a concert. It was a drive through the Tennessee backroads in Carl's pickup truck. No cameras, no fans, just two young souls laughing and dreaming under the southern sky. Dolly once admitted that Carl told her on their wedding day, "I'll never stand in your light, but I'll always be behind you." And he meant it. Over the years, Carl avoided all spotlight. He didn't accompany Dolly to events, didn't do interviews, and never once used her fame for his own gain. While tabloids speculated he didn't exist, he was at home in the Smoky Mountains, keeping the garden alive and feeding the dogs. And that's exactly how Dolly wanted it. She respected his desire for privacy and loved him more for it. Their relationship was built on opposites. Her spark, his stillness, her global fame, his reclusive peace. And as she explains now, Carl gave her the one thing no one else could: a sanctuary, a quiet place to be herself. Not Dolly Parton the icon, but Dolly, the girl from Locust Ridge. For a woman constantly performing, Carl was the one soul she never had to perform for. Behind the rhinestones, wigs, and laughter, Dolly Parton's love story with Carl Dean was rooted in something so ordinary it almost didn't feel real. And yet, that's exactly what made it last. Dolly has always said, "My songs are dramatic, but my life at home is not." And Carl? He was the calm in the middle of her global storm. At 79, Dolly is finally admitting just how deep his influence ran, not just in her personal life, but in the heart of her music. You won't find Carl's name in liner notes or award speeches, but listen closely to the lyrics of songs like "From Here to the Moon and Back," and you'll hear him, you'll feel him. That song, in particular, was written for him. And for someone who refused to be in the spotlight, Carl quietly became the muse behind some of Dolly's most emotional and enduring ballads. Their love wasn't broadcast. It was written into melodies, tucked between verses, hidden in the way Dolly's voice cracked on certain lines, and no one even realized it. Dolly has revealed that Carl didn't even like her music. "He's not necessarily one of my biggest fans," she once joked. "He likes Led Zeppelin and bluegrass," but that didn't matter. Carl didn't love the entertainer. He loved the girl who came home and kicked off her heels, the one who made cornbread from scratch and laughed at old reruns of The Andy Griffith Show. That unconditional love grounded Dolly in a way fame never could. But the biggest surprise came when Dolly opened up about just how much she protected Carl in return. When she did photo shoots or interviews at their home, she'd ask crews to stay clear of the backyard. That was his domain. She even designed their house so he had private exits and could avoid the chaos. There was no resentment in this arrangement. In fact, Dolly found it romantic. "He's like a ghost," she once laughed. "But he's my ghost." And yet, not everything was always picture perfect. There were hard times, long tours, health scares, and the weight of two very different worlds colliding. But their relationship endured not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Carl never tried to change Dolly, and Dolly never tried to drag Carl into a world he didn't want. Their love survived because it didn't need to be public, to be powerful. Now, at 79, Dolly's words carry more weight. As she speaks about Carl, her voice softens. It's not the voice of a country legend. It's the voice of a woman who knows she found her one true constant in a world that never stops spinning. Of all the things Dolly Parton has built, her legendary career, Dollywood, and a music empire spanning 6 decades, perhaps the most remarkable was the invisible wall she constructed around her marriage to Carl Dean. It wasn't made of stone or steel. It was made of silence, boundaries, and fierce love. And for years, that silence sparked endless rumors. Was Carl even real? Were they really together? Was it all an image? But now, at 79, Dolly is finally lifting the veil, and the truth is even stranger and more beautiful than the speculation. Carl Dean was not a ghost, but he might as well have been. He never walked a red carpet. He never stood in the audience at the CMAs. He didn't attend album release parties or Nashville industry galas. Most of Dolly's team never met him, but he was always there, quietly, behind the scenes, waiting at home with a smile and a joke. When fans wondered if Dolly was keeping a secret, the answer was yes. But not the kind they expected. The secret wasn't scandal, it was sanctuary. In interviews, Dolly has started sharing rare glimpses of that world, like how Carl would write her little poems and leave them on the kitchen table, or how he built her a stone fire pit in their backyard just so she could roast marshmallows when she couldn't sleep. These weren't grand gestures, they were personal, intimate, and deeply ordinary, and that's exactly what Dolly cherished. "He's always loved me just the way I am," she once said. "No makeup, no wig, just me." Perhaps the most touching revelation came when Dolly described how Carl reacted to her fame. He never felt threatened, never asked her to quit, but he also never pretended to care about the spotlight. In fact, Dolly once admitted that Carl has only seen her perform once in concert, early in her career. He said, "He didn't want to see me work. He wanted to see me as his girl, not the performer." That one statement revealed everything. But Dolly's protection of Carl wasn't just about love. It was about survival. In a world where celebrity marriages are devoured by tabloids, Dolly knew their bond had to be kept sacred. She created 2 lives, one for the cameras and one just for Carl. And while the public adored her for the rhinestones and charm, Carl adored her for the woman underneath it all. Now, as Dolly reflects on their decades together, the real story begins to emerge, not one of isolation, but of incredible intentionality. Carl Dean was never Dolly's shadow. He was her anchor. And their love wasn't hidden because it was fragile. It was hidden because it was too powerful to be shared with the world. There was always a quiet poetry to the way Dolly Parton spoke about Carl Dean. Brief mentions here and there, always respectful, always affectionate, but never quite pulling back the curtain. For decades, the mystery only deepened as Dolly's fame skyrocketed. She became a global icon, beloved for her music, her business empire, her philanthropy, and her unmatched charisma. Yet, the man she loved most stayed entirely out of view. That kind of restraint in the celebrity world was almost unheard of, and it made the myth of Carl Dean all the more compelling. But the real revelation came not in a television interview or a headline-grabbing memoir, but in Dolly's decision to finally share their wedding photos on their 50th anniversary. It was one of the most unexpected and touching moments in country music history. After half a century of shielding Carl from the spotlight, Dolly finally opened the family album. And what fans saw wasn't Hollywood glamour. It was sincerity. A simple, beautiful moment frozen in time. Dolly in a modest gown, Carl in a suit, both beaming like two kids in love. That photograph told a truth more powerful than 1,000 rumors. In that moment, Dolly wasn't the queen of country. She was just a wife, deeply in love with the same man she met outside a Nashville laundromat in 1964. And Carl wasn't a mystery anymore. He was real, honest, still fiercely private, but now, finally, part of the story she was ready to tell. Dolly has since opened up about their strange and beautiful relationship dynamic. Carl, she says, has always been her biggest fan, just not in public. He listens to every album, offers unfiltered feedback, and often jokes that he prefers her rock and roll songs to the country hits. He supported her decisions, even the bold ones. When she posed for Playboy in the 1970s, Carl didn't object. In fact, he framed the cover and kept it in his private office for years, not because of vanity, but because he was proud of her boldness, proud of her courage. They've faced health scares, industry pressure, and the long loneliness that comes from spending months apart. But what kept them going was humor and loyalty. Dolly says Carl makes her laugh every day, sometimes when she needs it most. And unlike many celebrity couples, they never pretended to be perfect. They simply refused to let the outside world define their bond. Carl Dean wasn't absent from Dolly's life. He was its heartbeat, steady, unseen, and always there. And now, at 79, as Dolly allows that truth to come into the light, the world is finally understanding the full picture. The rhinestones, the wigs, the stadium tours, they were part of the legend. But Carl was home. Carl Dean didn't just stay out of the spotlight. He made a point to disappear from it entirely. No interviews, no red carpet appearances, not even blurry tabloid photos. For most fans, his face was less familiar than Dolly's wigs. And yet, Dolly never described this as strange or strained. In fact, she insisted it was part of the very reason their marriage lasted. According to her, the moment Carl saw how fast fame was wrapping itself around Dolly, he decided to step aside and let her shine fully, without interference. He wasn't intimidated by her success, he admired it. But he also had no desire to be caught in the chaos of public life. Behind the scenes, however, Carl played an integral role in Dolly's world. He helped her make big decisions, always grounded her with common sense, and gave her space to be vulnerable in a world that constantly demanded she be strong. One of Dolly's most striking revelations came during an old radio interview that resurfaced online. "I'd come off the road, exhausted and worn out, and Carl would just hand me a grilled cheese sandwich and say, 'Sit your little behind down,' and somehow, that made me feel like everything was okay again." Carl's presence in her life was like that sandwich, simple, comforting, and full of love. He didn't need the world to see him, he just needed Dolly to know he was there. The couple's home life was far removed from the glittering fantasy people might expect. They spent quiet nights watching TV, reading, and gardening. Carl, an avid car enthusiast, spent hours tinkering with his vehicles, while Dolly often wrote songs in her pajamas. They'd take long drives through the Tennessee hills, sometimes without speaking much, just enjoying the hum of the road and the silence of understanding. That simplicity, that consistency, was their secret weapon in an industry built on noise. Even Dolly's legendary theme park, Dollywood, was something Carl had mixed feelings about. He supported it, loved seeing it thrive, but he only visited once. Crowds weren't his thing. He preferred the solitude of his farm, the company of dogs, and the whisper of trees over the roar of roller coasters. As Dolly turned 79, she looked back at her life not just as a country music icon, but as a wife. And what she said stunned many. "Carl gave me the one thing no one else could, a place to be myself." That's a powerful thing to admit after decades of being everyone else's fantasy. But for Dolly, it was the truth. In a world that often demands performance, Carl gave her permission to just exist. And now, after all these years, Dolly is finally letting the world into that private paradise she guarded so fiercely. A paradise built not on fame, but on the quiet, steady love of a man who never needed applause. For years, people speculated whether Carl Dean even existed. Was he a myth? A character Dolly invented to keep her private life sacred? After all, in nearly 6 decades of marriage, he appeared in no red carpet photos, gave no interviews, and refused even the smallest public gesture of recognition. But according to Dolly, that was by design. Carl isn't imaginary, she once laughed. He's just invisibly loyal. Behind that invisibility was a love story so rare, it almost feels fictional. Carl Dean wasn't interested in Dolly's fame, her fortune, or the empire she built. He didn't want to control it. He just wanted her to survive it. He would jokingly tell her, "You go out and make the money. I'll stay here and make the sandwiches." And while that might sound like a quip, it masked a much deeper truth. Carl Dean gave Dolly something she couldn't get from anyone else in the industry: normalcy. When she came home after performing to tens of thousands of fans, Carl didn't treat her like a goddess. He treated her like Dolly, the girl he met at the wishy-washy laundromat in Nashville in 1964. She'd come home still buzzing with sequins and spotlight, and Carl would be sitting on the porch with a dog at his feet, a fishing pole nearby, and a plate of cornbread waiting. That grounded her. That reminded her who she was underneath the rhinestones and platinum records. He kept her secrets. He held her tears. And when she doubted herself, he reminded her that success hadn't changed the woman he fell in love with. Even when she contemplated plastic surgery or worried her image was fading, Carl would simply say, "You looked better to me when you were wearing overalls and had chicken feed in your hair." That wasn't just country charm. It was deep, unwavering love. Dolly often said that Carl never once asked her for anything. Not a song, not a name drop, not a backstage pass. He didn't want anything from her career, because he knew she already gave it all to the world. What he wanted was the piece she kept for herself, and that was the part he protected with a quiet, loyal kind of fierceness that made her feel safe. When Dolly started opening up about Carl more in recent interviews, fans were stunned, not just by the stories, but by the realization that the most private part of Dolly's life might have been the most beautiful. Carl Dean was more than just the man behind the curtain. He was the heart behind the legend. And at 79, Dolly seemed finally ready to say out loud what she'd kept close for decades: that her greatest love story wasn't one she sang about, but one she lived in silence. When Dolly Parton turned 79, something shifted in how she talked about Carl Dean. It was as if she'd been holding in decades of memories, some too tender, some too painful, and some too strange to share while they were still unfolding. But now, with the twilight of her career in sight, Dolly seemed ready to let the world peek behind the curtain of her marriage. And what people saw wasn't just love. It was mystery, mischief, and moments that nearly changed everything. Dolly admitted that there were times she and Carl almost gave up, not because of betrayal or scandal, but because being the wife of Dolly Parton meant sacrificing anonymity, freedom, and any sense of normalcy. She recalled a stretch in the late 70s when Carl packed a bag and disappeared for 3 days, leaving nothing but a note that read, "I need to breathe." Dolly didn't call the police. She didn't panic. She waited. When he returned, she didn't yell. She just asked, "Are you done breathing?" And Carl, with that dry grin of his, said, "For now." It was one of those moments where love didn't need drama, just space. But perhaps the most shocking story came when Dolly confessed that she and Carl had quietly renewed their vows not once, but 3 times over the decades, in private ceremonies, in places no one ever suspected. The first was in their backyard, the second was in a tiny chapel in the Smoky Mountains, and the third in a hospital room, when Carl had a health scare that nearly took him from her. He was hooked up to every machine you can imagine, Dolly said, her voice cracking, but he squeezed my hand and said, "If this is it, "Marry me again." A nurse served as their witness. Dolly wore no makeup, no gown, just a hospital visitor badge and a tear-streaked face. That was Carl Dean. No flash, no spotlight, just quiet devotion. She also shared how Carl kept every love letter she ever wrote him, locked away in a wooden box under their bed, even ones scribbled on napkins or candy wrappers. "I never knew until I tripped on the box one night," she said. "He'd saved them all." And in that moment, she realized that while she had given her voice to the world, Carl had kept her words, the private ones, for himself. Now, as she enters her 80s, Dolly is slowly unpacking that treasure chest of memories. She's choosing to share stories that once belonged to just the two of them, and with every new detail, it becomes clearer. Carl Dean wasn't just Dolly's husband. He was her hidden sanctuary, a man who never wanted to be famous, but ended up becoming the most legendary mystery in country music history. In her most revealing moment yet, Dolly Parton sat down in a quiet corner of her Tennessee home and finally opened up about the question that had haunted fans for decades. Why did Carl Dean stay in the shadows for so long? For years, people speculated wildly. Some claimed Carl didn't exist at all, that Dolly had fabricated him to maintain an image of wholesome devotion. Others whispered about secret divorces, double lives, and Hollywood-style scandal. But Dolly had never cared much for rumors. She let people believe what they wanted, until now. At 79, Dolly finally told the truth. Carl Dean wasn't hiding from fame. He was protecting her from it. She explained that in the early days of her career, she'd bring Carl along to events and red carpets. But the attention, the cameras, the pressure, it made him physically sick. At one event in the late 60s, after being mobbed by photographers, Carl reportedly locked himself in a hotel bathroom for hours. Dolly recalled sitting on the floor outside the door, listening to him breathe heavily, knowing she'd have to choose, take him along for the ride or let him stay behind and preserve their love. She chose love. From that point forward, Carl stopped going to events. He stopped giving interviews. He built a life of quiet devotion, showing his love in private ways. He'd leave notes in Dolly's lunchbox, mow the lawn in the shape of hearts, and wait up for her after long tours just to heat up her dinner. But the most emotional part came when Dolly revealed Carl's last request. "He told me," she said, holding back tears, "when I go, don't tell anyone right away. Take some time. Grieve without the cameras." That moment hasn't come yet, but Dolly said she's prepared. And when it does, she'll honor his wish, just like she's honored his life. With silence, with song. At 79 years old, Dolly Parton finally revealed the truth about her complicated relationship with Porter Wagoner. And what she said left fans stunned. For decades, country music lovers have speculated about what really happened between the two icons. To the world, they were the perfect pair. The sparkling young singer with the golden voice and the seasoned entertainer with the flashy suits. But behind the rhinestones and hit songs lay a story of control, heartbreak, betrayal, and forgiveness that Dolly kept hidden for years. Porter Wagoner wasn't just her mentor and duet partner. He was also the man who nearly destroyed her career, yet gave her the push that made her a legend. Their bond was at once beautiful and toxic. And for the first time, Dolly is peeling back the curtain to share what really unfolded between them. This is not just a story about music. It is a story about love, power, ambition, and the kind of forgiveness that only comes with time. The year was 1967, when Dolly Parton, a rising but still relatively unknown singer from the hills of East Tennessee, walked onto the set of The Porter Wagoner Show. Porter had been looking for a replacement for Norma Jean, who had left the show, and at first, audiences weren't sure what to make of Dolly. She was different. Her voice soared with a raw mountain edge. Her personality sparkled with a mix of innocence and ambition, and her look was unlike anyone else in country music at the time. Porter wasn't immediately convinced either. He thought the audience might reject her, that her style might clash with the show's established rhythm. But what no one could have predicted was that the pairing of Dolly and Porter would ignite one of the most successful duos in country music history. On stage, their chemistry was undeniable. Porter, with his rhinestone suits and sharp comedic timing, played the confident showman, while Dolly, with her humble charm and powerhouse voice, brought a freshness the audience couldn't resist. Week after week, millions tuned in to watch them sing duets, banter back and forth, and create the illusion of effortless harmony. Soon, Dolly wasn't just part of the show. She was the show. Her presence drew new viewers, and her talent elevated the music. But behind the curtain, the story was more complicated. Porter was proud of discovering her, and he loved the attention her success brought to his program. Yet he also felt a growing sense of ownership. He often introduced Dolly as "my girl" or "my discovery." And while Dolly was grateful for the opportunity, she bristled at the implication that she belonged to him. Even in those early days, Porter had a controlling streak that left Dolly both indebted and uneasy. Still, she endured it, pouring her heart into the partnership. Together, they recorded songs that climbed the charts. "The Last Thing on My Mind," "Please Don't Stop Loving Me," and "The Pain of Loving You." Their voices blended in a way that seemed destined, a perfect balance of steel and silk. Country music magazines branded them the Golden Duo, and fans speculated endlessly about whether their bond went beyond music. Dolly always maintained that it was a professional partnership, but even she couldn't deny the intensity of their connection. As the late 60s turned into the 70s, Dolly's star was rising faster than anyone expected. She was winning awards, drawing fan mail by the truckload, and becoming a household name. Porter knew he had helped build this empire, and he wanted to keep her close. He offered her guidance, opportunities, and even fatherly advice at times, but in return, he expected loyalty. He expected Dolly to stay where he believed she belonged, by his side. What began as a mentorship had already planted the seeds of conflict, and though no one could see it yet, those seeds would grow into one of the most dramatic feuds in country music. By the early 70s, Dolly Parton and Porter Wagoner had become one of the most recognizable duos in country music history. Their names were spoken together as though they were one and the same. The Porter Wagoner Show was at its peak, drawing millions of viewers each week, and their touring schedule seemed endless. From the Grand Ole Opry to sold-out auditoriums across the country, their voices filled the airwaves, and their faces became fixtures in magazines and television specials. They recorded chart-topping albums, and their duets seemed to capture the very essence of country music itself, raw, emotional, and honest. Songs like "The Last Thing on My Mind" and "Please Don't Stop Loving Me" became classics and cemented their image as the golden pair of Nashville. But behind that glittering surface, the reality was far more complicated. Success brought strain, and the cracks in their relationship were beginning to show. Porter, who had prided himself on discovering Dolly, felt an increasing need to control the trajectory of her career. He saw her growing stardom not only as a point of pride, but also as a threat. If Dolly rose too high, would she still need him? Would she stay loyal? Or would she walk away and leave him behind? These fears gnawed at Porter and often surfaced in moments of tension. Dolly, on the other hand, was ambitious from the start. She adored Porter. She respected him deeply. But she also knew she had dreams that extended far beyond the duets and beyond his television stage. She wanted to be a global star, to write music that spoke to the world, and to control her own destiny. Yet every time she inched toward independence, Porter tightened his grip. He dictated creative choices, argued over business decisions, and reminded her in front of others that she owed her success to him. Their relationship became a delicate dance of gratitude and resentment. In interviews, Porter often claimed Dolly as his girl, and while fans saw this as endearing, Dolly herself was quietly frustrated by the possessiveness. She was not a girl to be owned. She was an artist, a writer, and a visionary, but Porter could not let go. As their fame grew, so did the financial pressures. Touring, constantly recording multiple albums, and appearing on television weekly wore them both down. Tempers flared behind the scenes, and arguments became more frequent. Dolly remained professional, never letting the turmoil spill onto the stage, but those closest to the show knew the truth. Their once harmonious partnership was now strained by jealousy, ambition, and the struggle for control. Yet despite the battles, their voices continued to blend seamlessly. When the cameras rolled, and to audiences, they were perfection. The irony of their partnership was that the very success they built together was the same force that drove them apart. What the fans didn't know was that the storm had only just begun, and the day would come when Dolly would make a decision that changed everything for both of them. By 1973, the storm between Dolly Parton and Porter Wagoner had reached its peak. The public still saw them as the perfect country duo, but behind closed doors, their relationship had become a battlefield. Dolly was exhausted by the constant tug-of-war between gratitude and resentment. On one hand, Porter had given her the stage, the spotlight, and the platform that launched her career. On the other hand, his controlling nature, his insistence on taking credit for her rise, and his refusal to let her branch out on her own had left her feeling trapped. She had become too big for the confines of the Porter Wagoner show, and she knew it. Porter could sense it too, and the thought of losing her terrified him. He believed Dolly was his creation, and that without his guidance, she would falter. He fought to keep her tied to the show, appealing to her loyalty and reminding her of the promises she had made. But Dolly had already made up her mind. She had bigger dreams, and if she didn't take the leap, she would never know what she was truly capable of. She needed to leave, but she wanted to do it with love, not bitterness. And so she sat down one night with her guitar and poured her heart into a song that would become one of the greatest in music history. I Will Always Love You was not written for a lover or a fan. It was written for Porter Wagoner. It was Dolly's goodbye letter in melody, her way of telling him that while she loved and respected him, she had to go her own way. When she first played the song for him, Porter was stunned. The lyrics spoke directly to the bond they shared, to the pain of parting, and to the gratitude she still carried. He listened quietly, then reportedly told her it was the best song she had ever written. Yet even as he praised the song, he was furious at the reality behind it. He didn't want her to leave, and he certainly didn't want to lose the golden goose that had made his show thrive. Dolly, however, stood firm. She walked away from the show in 1974, marking the end of an era for country television and the beginning of her journey as a solo superstar. Fans were heartbroken. Some even blamed Dolly for betraying the man who gave her a chance. But Dolly knew she had no choice. The decision broke her heart, but it also set her free. And as fate would have it, I Will Always Love You became a hit not once, but twice. First in 1974, and again in 1982, and later in 1992, when Whitney Houston turned it into one of the biggest songs of all time. The song that was born from a painful goodbye became a timeless anthem of love and departure, cementing Dolly's genius as a songwriter. But while her career soared after the split, Porter was left behind. His bitterness grew, and his sense of betrayal festered. What had once been a partnership built on music had now turned into a feud, fueled by pride, hurt, and a love that neither of them fully understood. Dolly had taken the leap she needed, but the shadow of Porter Wagoner still lingered over her life, and the consequences of her decision were only beginning to unfold. When Dolly Parton left the Porter Wagoner Show in 1974, the split was supposed to mark a bittersweet farewell sealed by the tender words of "I will always love you." But for Porter Wagoner, the reality of her departure was far less poetic. He watched as Dolly's solo career skyrocketed almost instantly. She released hit after hit, built a brand around her unmistakable look and voice, and quickly outgrew the shadow of his rhinestone suits and television stage. The more Dolly soared, the more Porter's resentment grew. He believed he had built her. He believed he had invested years of his time and his reputation into shaping her career. And now she was reaping all the rewards without him. To him, it wasn't just a loss of a partner. It was a betrayal fueled by ambition. That bitterness soon spilled into the courtroom. Porter filed a lawsuit against Dolly demanding millions of dollars, claiming she had breached their contract and owed him a share of her earnings. The lawsuit shocked fans who had always seen the two as inseparable allies. It revealed a darker side to their partnership, one that had been hidden behind the smiles and duets. Dolly tried to handle the matter quietly, but Porter's anger was relentless. He accused her of walking away from obligations he said she had made, and in interviews he made bitter remarks about her choices. Dolly, however, never lashed back publicly. She carried herself with grace, always speaking of Porter with love. Even when he was attacking her, she acknowledged his role in her rise, and she never denied the gratitude she felt for what he had done. But she also knew she had the right to stand on her own. The legal battle dragged on, casting a long shadow over both of their reputations. For Dolly, it was a painful reminder that success often comes with a cost. For Porter, it was a desperate attempt to hold on to a woman who had slipped out of his control. The case was eventually settled out of court, and while Dolly paid Porter a settlement, it was clear that their relationship had been fractured beyond repair. The lawsuit left scars that would take decades to heal. Yet even in the middle of that storm, Dolly's heart remained open. She later admitted that she wished things had not escalated to that point, that Porter's pride had forced them into a fight neither truly wanted. The irony was that even in his anger, Porter could not escape her shadow. Dolly's career was flourishing in ways he had once dreamed for himself, and no lawsuit could change the fact that the song she had written for him had become a global masterpiece. The fallout from that legal battle marked the lowest point in their relationship, turning once inseparable partners into estranged rivals. Their story, which had begun with promise and harmony, had now become one of the most dramatic feuds in country music history. And though they would one day find a way to reconcile at that moment in the mid-70s, the wounds were too fresh, the bitterness too sharp, and the silence between them too heavy to break. After the lawsuit, Dolly and Porter entered into a long stretch of silence that was as loud as any song they had ever sung together. For nearly 2 decades, the two hardly spoke. Their relationship, which had once been built on music, laughter, and the magic of live television, was reduced to bitterness and distance. Porter Wagoner carried his resentment openly. He often criticized Dolly in interviews, sometimes questioning her choices or dismissing her success as the result of luck rather than talent. He never fully admitted just how much her departure had wounded him. Instead, he let his pride do the talking, and his pride was sharp as a blade. Dolly, on the other hand, refused to engage in public feuds. She continued to speak kindly of Porter, always acknowledging his role in shaping her career. She never denied that she owed him gratitude, even if he had hurt her deeply. Her silence was not weakness, but strength, and it showed her ability to rise above bitterness while keeping her dignity intact. Yet that silence between them cut deep. Porter struggled with his own career during those years. Without Dolly by his side, his star began to fade. His albums did not chart as high, his show eventually lost its magic, and newer generations of fans began to associate Dolly with worldwide superstardom, while Porter became a fading memory of country television. His bitterness hardened as he watched Dolly win Grammys, break records, and step onto stages far beyond the Opry. Meanwhile, Dolly carried the scars quietly. Even though she had gone on to become a global icon, she admitted later that the split with Porter haunted her for years. She had written a song that was supposed to end things with love, but instead, their story had unraveled into lawsuits, harsh words, and silence. Their names that were once inseparable in country music lore had now become reminders of a friendship gone wrong. Friends in Nashville noticed the tension. Whenever Dolly's name came up around Porter, he would grow defensive or curt, and when Porter's name came up around Dolly, she would soften her voice carefully, avoiding negativity. It was clear they still cared, but neither could bridge the gap at that time. Fans speculated endlessly about whether the two would ever reconcile. Some believed the damage was permanent. Others hoped that time might eventually heal the wounds. But as the years rolled on and the silence dragged, Dolly and Porter seemed destined to remain estranged, two legends forever linked, yet forever apart. What no one knew was that fate had already begun setting the stage for their paths to cross once again, and that it would take the shadow of mortality to remind them both of what they truly meant to each other. By the early 2000s, Porter Wagoner was no longer the rhinestone cowboy who had once dominated the country music stage. His health was failing, his career had slowed to a crawl, and the bitterness he had carried for years had left him weary and lonely. The lawsuit, the silence, and the public criticisms had all but severed his bond with Dolly Parton. But when word began to spread that Porter was gravely ill, something inside Dolly shifted. She had spent decades moving forward, building an empire of music, movies, and business ventures, but deep in her heart, she knew she owed something more to the man who had given her her start. No matter the fights or the wounds, she could not let Porter fade away without making peace. Dolly quietly stepped back into his life. Visiting him during his illness, she extended the same kindness she had always carried, but now it came with a deeper sense of urgency. She offered not only her presence, but also her support, paying off some of his medical bills and making sure he received the care he needed. For Porter, who had once railed against her success, this act of compassion left him humbled. He had lost so much over the years, but Dolly's return reminded him of what they had shared in those early days on stage. Dolly never spoke harshly about the past during those visits. Instead, she chose to focus on gratitude, reminding Porter of the laughter, the songs, and the magic they had once created together. It was as if time had rewound, and the bitterness of decades melted away under the weight of forgiveness. For the first time in years, Porter allowed himself to see Dolly not as a rival who had left him behind, but as the young woman he had championed from the beginning. As his illness worsened, Their conversations grew softer and more meaningful. Dolly reassured him that their legacy together would never fade, that history would remember not the lawsuits or the fights, but the music that had touched millions. Porter clung to those words, finding comfort in the knowledge that despite everything, Dolly still cared. The reconciliation came quietly away from the cameras, away from the gossip columns, and away from the noise of the industry. It was not staged or forced, but genuine, born from two people who had once hurt each other deeply, and now realized that none of it mattered in the face of mortality. Their bond transformed in those final years. They were no longer mentor and protege, no longer partners turned adversaries, but simply two old friends bound forever by the music they had made. The illness that threatened to end Porter's life became the bridge that healed their broken relationship. Dolly later said that standing by Porter in those final years was one of the hardest yet most important things she ever did. It proved that love, forgiveness, and compassion can outlast even the deepest scars, and that sometimes the most powerful songs are not the ones sung on stage, but the ones written quietly in the heart when the lights have gone dim. In October 2007, the country music world was shaken by the news that Porter Wagoner had passed away at the age of 80. For fans, it was the end of an era, the loss of one of Nashville's brightest rhinestone stars. For Dolly Parton, it was far more personal. It was the closing chapter of a story that had defined so much of her life. When she received the news, Dolly felt the weight of history pressing down on her heart. The man who had once been her mentor, her partner, her adversary, and ultimately her friend was gone, and there would never be another chance to speak to him again. Yet in those final days leading up to his passing, Dolly had already made her peace. She had stood by his bedside offering comfort and forgiveness. And now she prepared to say goodbye, not just to the man, but to the complicated legacy they shared. At his funeral, Dolly's presence spoke louder than any words. She arrived quietly dressed in black, but carrying with her the aura of someone who understood the gravity of the moment. As she approached his casket, tears welled in her eyes. She placed her hand on the wood and whispered words that only Porter would ever hear. It was a gesture of love, respect, and closure, witnessed by those who knew how deep their story ran. During the service, Dolly stood before the mourners and shared her memories. She spoke of Porter with warmth, recalling the days of laughter backstage, the joy of singing side by side, and the lessons he had taught her even when they came wrapped in pain. Her voice broke as she reminded everyone that Porter was more than just her partner. He was her family in music, the man who had pushed her to become what she was, and without whom she might never have reached the heights she achieved. And then, in a moment that left the room silent, Dolly sang for him one last time. Her voice, though touched with grief, still carried the same strength that had once harmonized with Porter's on stage. She sang not as the superstar Dolly Parton, but as the young girl who had once walked onto his television set, nervous and eager to prove herself. The song was a farewell, a gift of love that transcended bitterness, lawsuits, and decades of silence. For those in attendance, it was a reminder that no feud, no hurt, no pride could erase the bond forged in music. Porter's casket was lowered into the ground that day, but his legacy did not end in the grave. It lived on in the songs, in the memories of fans, and most importantly, in the heart of Dolly Parton. Her final goodbye was not just to the man he had been, but to the storm they had weathered together. She left the service with tears in her eyes, but also with peace, knowing that forgiveness had healed what pride had once broken. To the world, it looked like the end, but for Dolly, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she could finally speak the truth about Porter without pain, where she could celebrate his memory without bitterness, and where she could carry his name with love instead of regret. At 79 years old, Dolly Parton finally decided to tell the unfiltered truth about her relationship with Porter Wagoner, and the revelations stunned even her most loyal fans. For decades, she had been careful with her words, always protecting both Porter's legacy and her own. But time had softened the wounds and given her the clarity to speak openly. In interviews and memoir reflections, Dolly admitted that her relationship with Porter was one of the most complicated of her entire life. He was not just a mentor or a colleague. He was a force that shaped her career in ways both beautiful and painful. She confessed that in the early days she felt deeply indebted to him, and she truly loved him like family. But the possessiveness, the controlling nature, and the lawsuit had cut her to the core. She revealed that leaving Porter was the hardest decision she had ever made, that she cried for weeks after walking away from his show, because she feared she was not only breaking her own heart, but his too. She admitted that writing "I Will Always Love You" was her way of trying to preserve their bond, even as she tore herself free. Yet she also acknowledged that the years of silence and bitterness nearly destroyed her memory of him, and there were times she wondered if they would ever reconcile. When Porter fell ill and she returned to his side, Dolly said it was like time had rewound. She saw not the man who had sued her or spoken harshly of her in public, but the man who once believed in her when no one else did, the man who gave her a stage when she was just a country girl with a dream. That perspective allowed her to forgive, and in forgiving, she found peace. At 79, Dolly reflected that forgiveness is the greatest lesson she learned from Porter Wagoner. She told fans that no matter how much pain or pride separates two people, the love underneath can survive if you let it. She admitted Porter broke her heart, but he also gave her the push she needed to become the woman she was destined to be. Without him, she said she might never have had the courage to chase her dreams as fiercely as she did. She acknowledged that he could be cruel, that he could be stubborn, and that he could wound her with words that lingered for years. But she balanced that with the truth, that he also laughed with her, supported her, and believed in her when others doubted. What Dolly revealed at 79 was not a story of saint and sinner, but a story of two flawed human beings bound by music ambition and a complicated kind of love. In her words, Porter Wagoner was both the best and the hardest thing that ever happened to her. She had spent years carrying the scars, but now she chose to carry only the lessons. She told fans that when she thinks of Porter, now she doesn't dwell on the lawsuit or the bitterness. She remembers standing on stage, singing side by side, their voices blending like they were born to harmonize. She remembers his laughter, his flamboyant suits, his determination to entertain, and she remembers the way he introduced her to the world with pride. She said that if he were alive today, she would thank him again, not for the pain, but for the journey. Because without Porter Wagoner, there would be no Dolly Parton as we know her today. Her final words about Porter left fans in tears, because they revealed the full arc of a story that had spanned decades. It was not just the tale of a partnership gone wrong, it was the story of two people who shaped each other's lives in ways neither could escape. It was a love story, not romantic, but deeper than that. One born of music, ambition, heartbreak, and finally, forgiveness. Dolly's revelation proved that sometimes the greatest stories are not about perfect harmony, but about discord resolved and wounds healed. She told the world that Porter Wagoner will always be with her, not as a ghost of bitterness, but as a reminder of the road she traveled to become who she is. And in that confession, Dolly Parton not only honored Porter's legacy, but also taught the world a lesson about love, loyalty, and the power of forgiveness, leaving fans with tears in their eyes and a renewed respect for the woman who never stopped singing even through heartbreak.